Adoption is supposed to be a beautiful story. A child is in desperate need of parental love, so a messy yet capable family steps in and saves the day. And the rest is happily ever after. But too often, even in an industry that should be focused on the needs of expectant mothers and access to qualified adoptive parents, happily ever after doesn't happen because life is not a fairy tale. The 20-year-old Giant Club found herself pregnant. To say that she was not in a position to raise a child would be an understatement. She was homeless, unemployed, and the father of her child was facing serious jail time. Recognizing that she could not give her child the life that they deserved, she reluctantly agreed to adoption. When she reached out to the Adoption Network Law Center, she was relieved to find that they were more than willing to help her through the processes of adoption and even take care of some expenses throughout her pregnancy. However, things took a turn when she began to have second thoughts about going through with the adoption after she found herself a job and better housing and overall in a more competent place to take care of her child and herself. However, because she was unable to pay back the expenses the adoptive parents already spent on her pregnancy, Cheyenne forever lost her baby boy. So today, let's uncover the real story behind the adoption industry in the United States. First, we'll begin by looking at how the current landscape has impacted the adoption industry. Next, we'll explore the common thread behind corruption in adoption. And finally, introduce some much-needed solutions to rewrite the narratives for all who have been victimized by this corrupt system. At the heart of any conflict is the initial conflict that sets everything in motion. In this case, that's the growing influence of reproductive restrictions in our nation, particularly abortion bans and the rise of crisis pregnancy centers. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, ending the constitutional right to abortions, the Supreme Court changed the lives of nearly 100 million women and forced more of them to look into adoption. What's worse is the rise of crisis pregnancy centers. Take California as an example. Even in a state where legislators have fought to uphold our reproductive rights, a database compiled by CalMatters finds that less than 2/3 of counties have abortion clinics, while over 80% has at least one crisis pregnancy centers. And if you haven't heard of these centers before, they're also known as anti-abortion clinics that coerce vulnerable women into remaining pregnant by misleading them about abortion procedures, contraceptive methods, and even spreading blatant misinformation by making claims such as abortion equals the execution of a baby after its birth, despite the fact that infanticide has clearly been illegal in every single state. All this to say, current attitudes regarding abortions has led to more expectant mothers who are unfit to raise a child towards the option of adoption. But despite its rising popularity, the adoption industry continues to exploit both the needs and desires of both prospective parents and expectant mothers. They exploit adoptive parents and tell them what they want to hear because they need their money. And they exploit expectant mothers and tell them what they want to hear because they need their babies. They disguise themselves as nonprofits to cover their trails and make people think that they are not in it for the money. When in reality, their work is no different than selling children. What allows for this to happen is the lack of regulation on private adoptions, despite the fact that nearly 40% of adoptions go through the private sectors, according to a study conducted by the National Survey of Adoptive Parents. In 2021, Times Magazine reviewed an agreement by the ANLC, the very agency that took advantage of Cheyenne, and they found that prospective parents are charged over $25,000 in fees, not including the legal costs. the birth costs, and finalizing the overall agreement for this adoption. These deals are used to lure in expectant mothers like Cheyenne, the promises of support and the illusion of control, but once things get going, it becomes very obvious that walking away isn't an option. In an interview conducted with Cheyenne, she explained that you have to buy your own baby back, almost. And tragically, most birth mothers cannot afford such expenses, and ultimately lose their child as Cheyenne had 14 years ago. As heartbreaking as it is, Cheyenne is just one of tens of thousands of mothers who have lost their children from the system. Thus, I advocate for the swift passing of the Keeping Infants Domestically Safe Act of 2019, a legislation that was proposed by Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith in the 116th Congress. Currently, federal law only prohibits the sale of children, but it facilitates pornography or prostitution. However, this loophole still allows for the sale of children for non-sexual purposes, such as financial gain, which is the main driver of a corruption amongst private adoption agencies. The KIDS Act would criminalize the selling of a minor for any reasons, and offenders would be subjected to a minimum 30-year sentence in prison. That's stiffer than the 15-year minimum sentence for sex trafficking a minor in the status quo. Our government has a responsibility to protect expectant mothers, especially from individuals who would try to profit from the exploitation of their children and the exploitation of their financial needs. This legislation would give federal prosecutors another tool under their belt to stop questionable practices at agencies profiting off of both adoptive and expectant parents, because these are such vulnerable people and they deserve so much more than greed. It's imperative that we pass the KIDS Act to punish those who abuse the legal adoption process in an industry that has been largely unregulated since the very beginning and shouldn't even be viewed as a market in the first place. When Cheyenne lost her child to a greedy agency, that damage was real and irreversible. Now, the nuance of the story cannot be conveyed in mere minutes, yet I assure you this is just the tip of the iceberg. Her experience is more than just a story, but a reality for too many mothers in our nation. It is a tragedy that should serve as a reminder that human beings and dollar signs do not belong in the same equation, because that is just another recipe for disaster.